We now enter the panel discussion. We've just been briefed on the Silicon Valley Index. Now we're going to talk about what it means and where we go from here. And before I introduce Raquel Gonzalez from the bank, I want to tell our streaming audience that you have the opportunity to participate. Please utilize the chat feature, and your questions will be monitored here in the room. And we will select as many as we can to send to the moderator on the stage. So just post those in the chat, and we'll do our best to work them in. Now please meet Raquel Gonzalez. She is our partner at Bank of America and our generous sponsor for a portion of this conference. Thank you, Raquel.
Thank you, Russ. And good morning, everyone. Our partnership with Joint Venture spans many years. And this event is one of my personal favorites. It truly is a time to reflect and learn on all those indicators we just heard Russ discuss that really reveal both the positive trends and the very real challenges that our valley faces. The data represented in the indicators comes to light for me and for our colleagues at Bank of America through our clients, from individuals and small businesses to the large corporations and institutions, as we help them manage their unique financial needs every day. And the data also helps inform how, at Bank of America, we support our community. It helps surface critical issues that are standing in the way of economic issues for so many. Issues like access to capital for small businesses, access to affordable housing, and training for job reskilling and upskilling. Through our partnership with the Latino Business Action Network, the Housing Trust of Silicon Valley, and JobTrain, plus other organizations, we're working to address the issues that we talked about. But I think we'll hear from our panel and further discussion today, it takes commitment and investment from all for us to realize the full potential of Silicon Valley. And with that, I have the privilege of introducing the panel discussion. We've invited two people with multifaceted experience to discuss the index in more depth and help bring the data to life for us. First, Michele Lew. She is the president and CEO of the Health Trust. She has spent most of her career laser-focused on equity and community health. She also has a deep understanding of politics and policy from her time in Sacramento. Prior to joining the Health Trust, Michele was at Stanford Healthcare. She is also executive director of the Asian Americans for Community Involvement, or affectionately known as ACI. Jim Wunderman is president and CEO of the Bay Area Council, comprising more than 300 of our region's companies across a wide range of industries. Under Jim's leadership, the council has secured billions of dollars for affordable housing, regional transportation, climate resilience, early education, and healthcare. Finally, we have an insightful moderator, Dr. Caroline Simard, who leads the VMWare Women's Leadership Innovation Lab at Stanford. Dr. Simard, I am going to turn over to you, and we're excited for the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, and I just want to highlight the incredible work that this report has done, especially this year. So when I was a graduate student at Stanford studying networks of innovation, not to date myself, but I was one of the readers of the earlier versions of the State of the Valley and literally pouring through. And I can't tell you how many colleagues I told about this year's report, colleagues that really research inequality, inequity, and it's incredibly well done. I think it sets the stage for what is possible for regions to do in really examining inequality. So thank you to the whole team for doing that. I am also grateful to Stanford Taiko because the data had a way of being hard to ponder and digest and reflect, and I don't want us to lose that amount of reflection, but I felt like the drums also gave us the oomph that we need to really think about how do we work on this together. So I really appreciated the power that they brought to this stage for us to have this conversation. And so This year, the State of the Valley is especially important, both because it looks at inequity, so has that deep lens, but also because we've been deeply affected by the pandemic, right? And a big question that came up is Silicon Valley is a place known for the power of geography, the place where it happens, right? We've always said to people, no, you need to move here to be able to be a part of the action. And the pandemic has really disrupted our very notion of geography. Why are we here? Is this still a place, the place, right, for innovation and talent flows? And we are seeing some migration out for the first time in many years. So I want to start by asking you, Jim, as the leader of Coalition of Companies, what are you seeing has been the impact of the pandemic on geography? And what are companies worried about when it comes to Silicon Valley as the place for innovation?
Well, thanks, Caroline, and thank Joint Venture Silicon Valley. That's quite an amazing report. Russ, what an amazing job. I'm tired, and I haven't said anything yet, just watching it. Awesome. It's great to actually be somewhere and be at Stanford, and I'm probably rusty at this too. It's been a while. And, little known fact, this is always a great conference. And Russ and I took our respective jobs around the same time, I think 2004. And so we started at the same time. Before Russ was here, he was at the Bay Area Council, which is something a lot of people probably know. What you don't know, and I don't know if Russ remembers, is we used to do the Bay Area Council Outlook Conference in January or so, February, it was Outlook Conference. And when Russ came in and I came in, he said, we'd really like to do it in January. We'd like to do the State of the Valley. Would you mind pushing your conference back? I don't know if he actually asked or he just did it. But whatever it was, we did that. So, and then eventually Outlook didn't make much sense in May, so we now call it the Pacific Summit. But we did that out of a very high regard for Russ and for this work that you've been doing on this index. It's extremely important. To get to your question, the companies are seeing this pandemic in many different ways. The dust hasn't completely settled on it yet. So, in terms of people returning, companies are at different stages. Many of them have changed their plans as the virus changed its plan over the course of time. But what we are seeing, and from the work you see and the report, we've got an increase in the number of economic activity. That was made very clear. According to the report, the jobs are back, but the population is decreasing. So somehow people are leaving. We've been seeing a trend in a downward net domestic migration. It was offset by immigration and live births, which are now less in both cases. And so we're seeing declining population, but an increase in jobs. How do you do that? I don't know how you do that. And how do you sustain that if, in fact, somehow we're sustaining it? So what it says is, and what we hear anecdotally, and it's great to have the report so we can be less anecdotal, but we do hear a lot of reports of companies hiring, filling these jobs, but filling them with people who don't live here. So a portion of everybody's workforce seems to be more remote. Maybe that'll change as people come back and, culturally things will be different. But I think the risks are very, very high. And, from a company standpoint, it's, the bottom line for a company is to succeed in doing what it's doing. So a company can change its strategy as to where it acquires its talent and how it operates. A region is a little bit different. We stand for Silicon Valley. We stand for the Bay Area and California, which, given the nature of this circumstance, these extremely high housing prices, way out of whack with anywhere else, this becomes a place where if you're really wealthy, if you've got one of those really wealthy type jobs that you saw, this place is okay. You can afford a house, you can afford a lifestyle. But for any other kind of job, you can't. And even if you're wealthy, you might prefer to be wealthier with a more modest, cost of living in some other part of the country. Might not be as nice, weather won't be as good, but you don't have to uproot yourself. The company can save costs and so forth. There are other factors here in terms of the overall business climate that make, extremely high taxation, regulations, risk of employment that companies are looking at these things. I hate when companies look at things because, you know, when you start analyzing and you get the CFOs involved in the company and you get the facilities folks on a cost basis, this place doesn't make sense as much. And so I'm very concerned about this, and that does reflect what I'm hearing from some of our members. I hear crazy stuff. So I think we should not rest on our laurels. I think we should take nothing for granted. Even though our innovation is going off the chart, it is now become an international thing. So innovation is happening. Silicon Valley does not have a monopoly on this anymore. The competition is swift. And we've got to really think about this. And I thought what Russ said, and the fact that we're here at Stanford, one of the leading places of thinking and innovation and in the world, is it is really time for us to think about this together and make sure that what we have is what we want. And we have I know we're going to get into the equity issue, but we have a place that's a place for everybody. And I'd love to work on that together.
Thank you so much. And what about you, Michele, as a nonprofit leader? What are kind of the impact of the pandemic you've seen on our region?
Yeah, thank you, Caroline and Jim. It's great to be in conversation with you. And I also want to thank Russ and especially Rachel Massaro. I don't know if she's in the room, but they and their team have done an incredible job of putting together a powerful index for us. To your question, Caroline, the pandemic has changed us permanently. There's been some bright spots. There's Wordle. I like Wordle. But beyond that, some of the things highlighted in the index, we've seen greater work flexibility for many of us, lower commutes for many of us, although not all of us. We have seen local philanthropic giving increase, thanks to incredible leadership from folks like Nicole Taylor at the Community Foundation. We've seen some bold initiatives. Project Home Key has converted hotels and motels into supportive housing for some of those 30,000 chronically homeless folks that Russ highlighted. But I think the main takeaway is what was laid out in the index. We can no longer ignore the racial, economic, and health disparities that are here right in our backyard. And if you're not fired up about that equity lens in the index, then we should talk more because it's infuriating. And I know that people are tired of diversity, equity, inclusion conversations. We've been to all the trainings. People don't like cancel culture. We complain about the wokeness in some of our TV shows these days, but there is a reason these conversations keep coming up, and there's a reason that we must have them, even if it makes us uncomfortable. And I'm mostly speaking to the white people. We need you to have the conversation with us, people of color, if we are going to build back better and make this a community where all of us are thriving.
Thank you. And let's pick up on this. So if we're at Stanford, so let's give ourselves a grade. If it's a report card, we're getting an F-, I'm pretty sure, if that exists, on equity. Socioeconomic, gender, and racial inequality in the region as a whole, but also within our institutions where we see people of color and women of color especially underrepresented in leadership in systematic ways, right? And white people being the minority and yet the majority in leadership. So the inequity within our institutions as well. I think the very powerful point that was done this morning that I think is a call to action is that we're reaching a level of inequity that is a signal of political instability. And when we think about the rise of employee activism, when we think about our students on our campus who are increasingly pushing to say, this is not enough, we are not doing enough, right? And you see the rise of this more activist pushing that we really need to do more and change. And so it's hard not to have a sense of cynicism when we look at all of our institutions in all of them is rhetoric on equity, right? And who we aspire to be in our institutions and in our community, and the reality of the numbers that we saw this morning, and that disconnect, right? So it's hard not to feel very cynical. So Jim, I want to go to you. How do you think companies specifically are thinking about these issues? And I know they're working hard on these issues because I've been a part of a lot of these conversations, and yet we're so far off the mark. So what are you seeing?
Well, it's hard not to be cynical. I'm old enough I grew up in New York City in the 60s in the civil rights movement. And you know, based on what was going on at the time and the power of that and the great society that was being pushed by President Johnson, I would never have thought that 50, 60 years later, we'd be having this conversation. It's hard, I wouldn't have thought it. And yet here we are, and in some ways it's even more oppressive. So it's clear that major action needs to be taken. Instability is not something that I think we seek. There's been so much incredible success in our society, but it's not been shared by any means. And the racism and the inequity, this is institutional. It's in our country. It's in our fiber, and we simply have to overcome it. And I think to the good, and as you mentioned, I think the companies here in Silicon Valley, they're taking it very seriously. And we didn't see senior officers of diversity and inclusion in virtually every company that's our member. That's the case. We have a committee at the BAC on DEI, and it's extremely well intended by these folks, all working together and seeing what each other is doing and trying to figure out what the best paths forward are. A lot of companies doing a lot of things. Educational requirements are changing. So it's not just based on your degree, but internships and apprenticeships and on-the-job training. I think the companies are really trying to apply their innovation to address this issue. They're setting goals, standards. We work as an organization to encourage companies to do it. We're looking at ourselves. So I think we're in a time when it is being taken very, very seriously. It's still too slow. You look at the numbers. The leadership, the numbers in leadership of people who aren't white is just way too low. But there is progress being made. I think it's great. The comment. I think the college campuses have to play a really big role in pushing the people ahead of it in terms of age to say, let's not have in another 50 years be having this conversation. This is the time. We have to take care of this. And wouldn't we be so much better off if we did it? We're doing a study right now at the BAC. One time I overheard a conversation by a fellow who's now our chair, is a fellow named Kaushik Rajgopal, who was the head of McKinsey for the Bay Area and then the United States. And I heard him talking to someone else, and he said this a few years ago. He said the growth in the economy that Russia showed during that period was 100% accountable to women growing in the economy. If it weren't for women, the improvement in women's condition economically, we wouldn't have seen growth in the U.S. economy during that recent period. I was shocked by this. I had no idea. And so I suggested, why don't we do a study on what would the overall economy look like if there were racial equity? What would it mean for everybody? Because it's not a matter of, well, now black and brown people have more, so I've got less. It's actually not how it works. It'll work for everyone. So, to your point about white people need to be allies and at the forefront of the movement, I think that's absolutely right. It's upon us to do this. And, maybe it feels like there's some sacrifices being made, but we'll come out with this report, in a few months, and I have a feeling it'll shock people as to how much better we can all be if we're able to achieve this. So I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing in the business community and also frustrated that it's not moving quickly enough.
Michele, what's your call to action? Because I think you've been on the ground of these conversations in terms of health equity. What we saw this morning is for, again, all of our discussions around equity, some people during the pandemic went home and worked in safety. mostly those of us who are in professional roles, who are better paid. And the lower wage employees, most of them who are people of color, had no choice but to show up for work. We called them essential, but I'm not sure this is the experience they were having. I think maybe some of them were feeling disposable. So I want to hear from you on what you saw play out here.
Caroline, I have to admit to feeling pretty cynical last summer when we saw white guy billionaires rocketing themselves into space while nonprofits on the ground were trying to get food and diapers and rental assistance to thousands of folks, mostly in our communities of color. So I'm a little bit more cynical than Jim, although he does give me some optimism. I think one of the blessings for those of us who work in the public and nonprofit sectors is that we saw who was essential during the pandemic. And while the Mark Benioffs of the world might give credit to the CEOs of the world for being the heroes, when I was on the ground, I saw the heroes being the frontline workers of color, the grocery store workers, the teachers who had to figure out Zoom and then go back in person, our community clinic heroes, our children's hospital folks. These are the folks who we need to make sure they have a home here in Silicon Valley. I do share joint venture and Jim's optimism, though. I think we can come together cross-sector and figure out these issues that are vexing Silicon Valley. In March of 2020, the Health Trust runs Meals on Wheels, and overnight demand skyrocketed 600%. And there was no time for competition. We had to partner with unlikely allies. We built a partnership with DoorDash. We became friends with a Mercedes dealership. We partnered with autonomous vehicle companies because we made a commitment that if a homebound senior calls us and they are hungry, we're gonna get them a meal, and we'll figure out the money part later. And thanks to many of you in this room who helped us figure out the money part. But I wanna live in a Silicon Valley where essential workers are revered and they have an affordable place to work and live.
So there's a question from the audience which tees this up really nicely. So we talk about the unsung heroes, right, of essential workers and people in nonprofit sector and our teachers. And sometimes we also celebrate the corporate heroes that intervene, but there's a question from the audience. Do you both feel like tech is being scapegoated for our problems? Do you feel like there's too much finger pointing going on at tech companies or at the wealthiest segments of our community? And this is a part not just of the conversation around equity, but it's been increasingly happening around tech ethics and the role of tech companies and technology innovation in avoiding negative consequences on society. So let's start with you, Jim.
Well, there's a question for you. So when you look at the number of billionaires and folks who are making incredible amounts of money, unthinkable not long ago, that Russ showed, it's easy to jump to how could it be that people could be so wealthy? And we've got, and I don't know if 30,000 is the right number for homeless people in the Bay Area, but our unsheltered homeless populations, 75% of the homeless are actually not even in a sheltered condition. And you see that, and it's absolutely glaring, and people find it unacceptable. And so I think it's natural to jump and say it's the fault of the people who are doing so well that the other people aren't doing so well. And it is an untenable situation. It feels like capitalism gone wild. And maybe that's the nature of capitalism, and sometimes you have to check it. It's a wonderful system that's gotten us an amazing country and wonderful things, but we also have this institutional racism in our history that we talk about. I would say in California, California is not uniquely loved in the rest of the country. I don't know if you know this. But you know, we suffer some reputational issues here, and you could see what's happening in Washington D.C. when the companies that were really the hero companies, and I'll just point out, you know, in the ones who are headquartered here, Meta, Apple, Google, you know, are up now sitting before Senate committees having to explain themselves. This wasn't the case a few years ago, and the threats on them are great, and the implications to our region are great. And my life is better because of Facebook and Google and Apple. I don't know what I would do without those folks. You know, I think now there are issues that I think have to be sorted through. But I think on the whole, it is a little unfair for you target anybody. You know, the blame game is not really the game we need to be playing. It is how do we work together better? What's the way to redistribute wealth in a society, which we need to do, uplift the service economy. Most of those folks that we're looking at, they're in some form of the service economy. And if you're in the service economy, you make a whole lot less money, even at these minimum wage levels, which don't accrue to a lifestyle that's a sustainable, acceptable lifestyle. So, you know, what do we do about that? And in a way that doesn't make California non-competitive with other places, so that over time we wither away, you know, the kind of middle-class jobs, and eventually see, you know, a diminution in our economic power, which then you lose the ability to distribute that over the society. So it's very, as Russ said, it's all very complex. But I would warn that, you know, let's not make business the target, and let's not make tech companies the target. Let's figure out how to do this. Let's get smart, you know, and figure this out and do it quickly. And I think a lot of folks would be willing to come to the table to do this.
I agree, Jim. I think we can have a capitalist economy, and we can have tech innovation, and we can also have a more equitable community here in Silicon Valley. And we need everybody to come to the table. These issues are complex, as Jim mentioned. We need the technology that the Googles and Apples and Facebooks bring to us, but we also need the human talent and lived experience from our community if we're gonna solve these problems for the long term.
Thank you so much. And so in 1 minute or less, so very quick, you have all of us ready to follow you in this call to action. So there was one thing that we were each going to do following this conversation. What would it be?
You know, I'd like to see more connectivity between the various organizations that are out there, all doing good things in seeking the solutions. I think this is a time for coming together and, you know, putting down our guard. And, you know, this is serious. You know, this remote work situation is not a small thing. This is a really big change. This housing problem that we have, it's not a crisis, it's a mega crisis that we are facing. And to solve it is going to take more than good intention. And we've got to come together around this and show how it can be done. It's our problem. We need to solve it.
That's great. So really a cross-sector conversation to continue working together. What about you, Michele? What's one thing we should each think about doing?
It's a little bit of a pivot, but I think it's really important. Russ flashed on the slide toward the end of his presentation, but let's take care of our own mental health and the mental health of the people around us. The last couple of years have been traumatic and exhausting and stressful, and when you look at the slides in the index about mental health, we can't solve these problems unless we're taking care of ourselves. There should be no stigma in seeking mental health support services. If you think you might benefit from a counselor, go see a counselor, it's good. And together we can be a healthier community.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for a wonderful conversation.
My wife's a clinical psychologist. I'll tell you, it said so. Yeah, I think you're right.
Michele Lew, Jim Wunderman, Caroline Simard.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for bringing your insight to our proceeding.
Okay, buddy.
Jim.